Hi, it's Claudia, and in this video, we are answering the question, what is anger? So, according to the dictionary, anger is a strong feeling of annoyance, displeasure, or hostility. So, what happens is that anger is basically an emotional response to something that we're experiencing, in particular, an unjust situation. So, whenever something that we experience as unjust happens, then the healthy emotional response is the feeling of anger. However, we must understand that our emotional responses are happening according to how we perceive a situation, and they have nothing to do with whether we perceive the situation correctly and accurately or not. So, our emotions are a response to the way that we perceive the situation, but it can happen that we perceive situations the wrong way or in an unhealthy way. And this is influenced, so the way that we perceive situations is influenced by what we saw or what we were taught growing up, different false beliefs that we may have picked up. Either we were taught them, we saw them, or we responded to different experiences with unhealthy beliefs or thoughts. And they are also influenced by the way that we responded to past situations. So, Jesus teaches us in the Bible how to respond to situations in a healthy way. And the fact that Jesus, who is the second person of God, teaches us this in the Bible, this information tells us that we don't naturally know this. We don't naturally know how to respond to things the correct way and the healthy way. So, what happens is, at least in my case, and I have seen this so much going on right now, nowadays, is that I have not been taught how to respond to situations the correct way. In my case, I had only been punished for responding to situations the wrong way. And then I had absolutely no way of realizing or of figuring out, okay, this was the wrong thing, but then there are all these other things that I could be doing. Which one of them is the healthy way? And this is what happens in the world today. So, when we talk about anger, we hear the term and the concept of anger management. And the problem with this is that for the most part, the teachings about anger are incomplete. So they are working with partial information because Jesus teaches us in the Bible what the healthy thing to do is, exactly because we cannot observe it on our own. We cannot figure it out on our own. So this is important for us to know, that he makes us the promise that if we do what he says, then we will know the truth, and then the truth will make us free. So we can be free from anger, from this emotion, but we must do what he teaches us to do. So we cannot come up with our own solutions. We cannot come up with our own coping things. I mean, we definitely can, but that will only take us so far. Jesus is the only one who will set us free. And this is what these video series are about. In particular, this video series on how to stop anger and bitterness. So what happens is that in reality, we live in a fallen world. So things will anger us when they happen. This is just the reality of our situation and of our lives. So we have to deal with three different types of anger. So the first one is healthy anger. So we know from the Bible that God gets angry. So we know that God is without sin. So the fact that he gets angry means that not all anger is wrong or unhealthy or a sin. So this is part number one. And then we need to understand that whenever we see something written in the Bible about God, we need to search and look and study if God tells us something about that thing. And this is what we're going to address in the next video. The fact that Jesus does tell us to be angry. So the fact that God is angry and the fact that Jesus teaches us that we are to be angry, this tells us that there is healthy anger that we can actually experience. And this happens when we experience a real unjust situation. When something happens that is truly unjust, objectively speaking, we experience it, and then our emotional response to that situation is healthy anger. And this is something that you could say it's built in. So it's not something we have to work at. We don't have to work at this emotional response. So this is the first one. Then we have unhealthy anger, which is when we feel anger in a situation that is not actually unjust. We just believe that it is unjust. We perceive it as unjust. Again, because of what we saw in the past, what we were taught, what we believed, sometimes we even pick up on false beliefs, by watching TV, by interacting with other people, or by what we saw our parents or our teachers or our friends do. So all these things can influence us to inaccurately perceive a situation as unjust. So that would be unhealthy anger. And then we have toxic anger, which we are referring to for the most part as bitterness. So this is aged anger. This is what happens to anger when we don't process it. So whether it is healthy anger or unhealthy anger, if we don't process it in the way that we are meant to, then it turns into bitterness or toxic anger. So what happens is that we are meant to actively process our emotions as soon as possible. So if someone gets us upset, whatever, they say something, they do something, and we get upset, then it is our responsibility solely to process those emotions right then and there. And that is what Jesus teaches us and commands us to do. And then when we don't do that, then that in and of itself, this passivity, you could say, or inactivity, is actually unhealthy, and it is a sin. So it is a sin to feel healthy anger and do nothing about it. Like that in and of itself is unhealthy, and that is literally how healthy anger turns into toxic anger. And this is when people start talking about anger management, because they don't realize that we can process it, even old anger, we can process it all the way and be free from it all the way. So I used to suffer from bitterness. So the way that it manifested in my life is that I felt my feelings of anger were so out of control that I could no longer choose how to respond. I would just be taken by the inertia of what I had been doing the previous years. And I would yell, I would say mean things to my husband or whoever upset me. It happened once that I even threw a glass on the floor, and I felt justified to do it. But all of that was wrong, because what Jesus says is we're meant to process our anger right then and there, and all of our emotions, of course, but now we're talking about anger, and then we are free from them. But because I didn't know any of this, I just kept getting upset and I didn't know what to do with it. And I used to believe the lie that time heals all wounds, and time does nothing. Time is just simply how we experience the reality, but it has no power over us. God created us with a mind and a will and emotions, and we are meant to actively process our emotions. Time does not do that. we are not dependent from God's perspective in any kind of way on any kind of anything. We are meant to be dependent on Him and turn to Him, process our emotions, and then move forward in life. So, what had happened in my personal life and experience is that growing up, ever since I can remember, I was abused by my parents. So this was not something that I perceived to be wrong. This was literally something wrong. They did the wrong thing. And by virtue of that, I was in an unjust situation. So we could say, I think my earliest memory, I was about 4. So ever since I was 4, up until I stopped talking to them, I was in unjust situations when I interacted with them. So my emotional response to that was healthy. But the fact that I did not process my anger because I didn't know how to at the time, that became my own problem. That became my own sin. So what happened was that my healthy anger initially turned into toxic anger, which we're referring to as bitterness, and then it got stuck in what is known as, you could say, the concept of the love tanks. So this is part of the concept of the 5 love languages, which is described in the book, The 5 Love Languages by Dr. Gary Chapman. So you could say that our love tanks is the equivalent of our hearts and minds. So we could have, like, technically our love tanks are meant to be filled with love, but when we don't process our emotions and we don't get them filled with love from God, what happens is that all these toxic emotions that we don't process just get stuck in there. So this is what happened in my case. So you could say in my heart or in my love tanks, there was all this toxic anger. So I would, whenever I remembered my parents, I would always just get so angry at what they had done to me. And I just couldn't move forward. I didn't know how to do that. And the thing is that when I was 19 years old, I actually moved away. I stopped living with them, but I was still financially dependent on them. So they still financially abused me until I was 26, I think, or 24, when I finished university. So then I moved to Greece, trying to get away from this anger that was stuck in my heart and in my love tanks. But actually, of course, I couldn't get away with it because time or distance, they do nothing. We are still, attached to our hearts and to everything that we haven't processed so far. So what happened was that, eventually I stopped talking to them. But again, this solved absolutely nothing. And what happened is that this anger, toxic anger, this bitterness was affecting my personality. And it was affecting my marriage. It was affecting my job in the sense that I didn't have any. I couldn't think of myself as a normal person who could do normal things. So even though, the actual physical abuse stopped when I was 19, I was 36 when I started my inner healing journey with Jesus. So that's like 17 years later, I was still affected by that anger that I initially felt. So this is why it's important that we process all of it. And we're going to talk about in the next video exactly what the solution to anger is, because whether it is healthy anger, unhealthy anger, or toxic anger, Jesus teaches us the way to process it is exactly the same. But sometimes we get stuck on the idea that, that the other person should do something differently for us to be able to process our emotions. And this is a lie that I was stuck with for 36 years of my life. I believed that I was completely powerless and that I needed my parents to stop abusing me initially and then to apologize for the fact that they abused me, for me to be able to move on with my life. But this is codependency, because I am dependent on someone else, and then I can do what I want to do. But that's not how God created us to be. God created us to be completely independent of other people. And again, we're going to look at that in the future videos. So we are meant to depend on God when it comes to processing our emotions, and not on other people. So these are the different types of anger that we may experience. And then what happens is that, again, based on what we experienced, what we saw, what we believed, and how we reacted to our experiences, anger may not look like anger. So for me, it was uncontrollable. I felt a surge of energy, and I felt like I needed to release it by being mean to other people, or by screaming and yelling and all these kinds of things. But other people experience anger differently. So it might be that they just feel hurt. It might be that they have, picked up on some kind of false belief that anger is always wrong, that anger is always destructive, that anger leads to divorce, or different things. So then it may be that some people do not allow themselves to feel anger, but they skip over and they just go into hurt, or they go into sadness and powerlessness. And this is again unhealthy, because Jesus teaches us that we are to feel anger, but we're not to be justified to do the wrong thing. And in this regard, so the way that my anger, all the different types, was manifesting itself is through aggressive behavior. So I wasn't shy, you could say, about the fact that I was angry. I was angry, and I expressed it in very destructive and unhealthy ways. But other types of destructive and unhealthy ways are passive aggressive behavior, which is also stemming from anger, and also from not processing it properly. So we all feel anger. This is an emotion that God has equipped us with to respond to unjust situations, because we cannot pretend that abuse is okay. We cannot pretend that hitting someone is okay. So if something like this happens, then anger is the healthy response, but then we need to process it for us to continue to stay healthy. So this is the thing about anger. It is healthy, but then it can turn really quickly into unhealthy anger. And in my case, because I have had so much to, I have lived a big amount, you could say, of unjust situations. So for me, I have this pattern of dealing with anger in destructive ways. So I have this pattern of, I want to say something to the other person. I don't want to do the right thing. I want to make them pay, you could say, with my words. But that is not what Jesus teaches us. So this could be something that I learned, and I did learn some of this wrong behavior from my parents. But I also think, in my personal case, that this is a tendency to sin. So sometimes we could end up coping with these unjust situations by learning what our parents did when they dealt with anger. And if they didn't do it Jesus's way, then our learning from them is called an iniquity. So they did the wrong thing, and then we learned that from them. They sinned, we sin because we learned from it. That's called an iniquity. Or it could be that, for example, let's say that someone's parents, that they were arguing a lot, and then they were, they had this big problem with anger, and they would say the mean things, just like I saw and I did. But then let's say that they got a divorce, And then this person who saw this happening, then they got so affected by the divorce that they promised themselves, I will never be angry. That's still a sin, and the Bible calls it an inner vow. That's when we respond with the opposite of what we saw, and it is equally unhealthy. So the only way to respond to anger, the healthy way, is to do what Jesus teaches us, which is what we're going to look at in the next video. So in this video, we're just looking at what is anger. This is a negative emotional response. So the emotion is negative. Anger is not a pleasant, it's not, it's not happiness. It's the opposite. It is a negative emotion, but it can be a healthy emotional response to an actual unjust situation. And this is the right thing. We cannot pretend that, hitting people is fine, killing people is fine. All of this, that's totally wrong and unhealthy. And the fact that we feel anger about it is healthy. So this is just like the fact that there exists healthy jealousy, but not all jealousy is healthy. So we need to understand the difference between these. And then what happens is that as we process our anger and all of our emotions, and we already talked about shame and condemnation, we talked about jealousy and envy, we talked about worry and anxiety. So we talked about all these different things, and we're meant to process all these things on a regular basis. So what happens is that this just clears up the mental and the emotional and the relationship space for us personally to be able to experience the reality accurately. Because, for example, in my case, what happened was that I had all this toxic anger in my heart, in my love tanks, and then this was clouding my judgment. So it was affecting my personality. I wasn't the person that God intended me to be because of this. And also, I was not able to feel love. I was only able to feel this bitterness and this anger at my parents for what they had done like 15 plus years before. So that's why it's important that we process this anger out and that we are free from it. So we don't need to manage it. We can completely process it out. But we need to understand that this is a skill. So anger is going to always be an emotional response to unjust situations. So what we can do to be free is we can clear up our mental space from these toxic emotions which are clouding our judgment, and we can perceive the reality accurately. So then we will only get angry when an unjust situation really happens. But because we live in a fallen world, this will happen. So we will feel anger, but we're limiting it to feeling healthy anger and then to process it. Because as I said, the way to process all kinds of anger is the same, regardless of which kind we're experiencing. So we're not getting rid of anger, healthy anger. We're getting rid of toxic anger and of unhealthy anger. And then with all this mental and emotional and relationship health, then we can experience the reality accurately. Then we can keep Jesus' commandments. We can be the loving people that God intended us to be. And then we can have, the relationships and the life that Jesus died so that we can have. And we can fulfill God's purpose for our lives. So this is really important to understand the different kinds. But we don't have to get stuck on that, because we just process it. Okay, I feel anger right now. I know what to do. I'm doing it, and then it's over. We don't have to dwell on where we picked it up, when we picked it up, why we picked it up, how we picked it up, and all of this, which is something I used to be obsessed with because I thought I needed all this information to be able to move forward, but we don't. So I hope that you found this video helpful. Thank you so much for watching. Please don't forget to click the like button, the subscribe button, and the little bell button to get notified of future videos. I hope you have a wonderful day, and I will see you next time. Bye.